The dark truth of disease and prostitution in World War I. Imagine this. A soldier, barely 19, fresh in the trenches, is marched not toward safety, but toward a tent filled with strangers. Inside, dozens of women wait, some coughing, some trembling, some broken beyond recognition. What he doesn't know is that stepping inside may be more dangerous than facing bullets, more fatal than standing in no man's land. This is not just a story about war. This is a forgotten horror of World War I, when prostitutes became weapons, and disease claimed more lives than gunfire. When we picture World War I, we think of muddy trenches, barbed wire, and endless artillery fire. But behind the smoke and gunpowder, another silent war was being fought. It was a war of flesh, desire, desperation, and exploitation. At the heart of it all were the women, the prostitutes, both forced and willing, who became trapped in a system so cruel, it turned their very bodies into instruments of suffering. Governments knew that young men, pulled from their homes and thrown into the nightmare of the trenches, would not simply suppress their needs. The longer they stayed in uniform, the more restless they became. Commanders feared that unrestrained soldiers would cause chaos in towns, assault civilians, or even revolt. So what did they do? They sanctioned it. They built brothels near the battlefields. These weren't glamorous places of escape. They were crude, hastily assembled tents or dark, overcrowded rooms. Soldiers lined up like machines, waiting for their turn. Some women were locals, driven by hunger to sell their bodies for bread. Others were captured in occupied towns, forced into prostitution under military orders. But here's where the story turned from tragic to horrifying. Venereal diseases, syphilis, gonorrhea, and others spread like wildfire. In France alone, 1 in 5 soldiers was said to be infected. Hospitals overflowed, not with men who'd been shot, but with men whose bodies were wasting away from diseases caught in those tents. And the authorities knew. They knew, and they let it continue. You see, soldiers were replaceable. Women were replaceable. To the war machine, both were expendable cogs. Military doctors inspected prostitutes in these brothels, but the inspections were a farce. Women who were clearly sick, women with visible sores, fevers, and bleeding, were still forced to work. Some accounts suggest that military leaders even turned a blind eye, believing that if men were infected, they could be kept in hospitals, controlled and away from the front until they were useful again. Others believed disease would weaken enemy troops when prostitutes crossed battle lines. In other words, disease became another weapon of war. For the women, the suffering was unimaginable. Some of them were forced to serve dozens of men in a single night. Their bodies broke down. Their spirits collapsed. They were not given medicine, not given rest, only orders. If they resisted, they were beaten. If they tried to escape, they were executed. If they became too sick to work, they were discarded like garbage. One French survivor, years after the war, wrote that she saw girls as young as 15 wasting away, their faces disfigured by untreated syphilis, while soldiers still lined up at their doors. No one cared if they lived or died, so long as they served the machine of war. And what about the men? Imagine being a young soldier, believing you found a moment of comfort, only to wake weeks later with burning pain, rashes, and shame. Hospitals were filled with men too humiliated to admit how they were infected. Some were sent back to the trenches untreated, where they infected others. By 1916, venereal disease had become one of the leading non-combat killers of World War I. More soldiers were incapacitated by infections and by bullets. But instead of shutting down the brothels, commanders doubled them. They believed it was necessary discipline. And here lies the cruel irony. These soldiers were promised honor, glory, and victory. Instead, they were handed disease, despair, and silence. These women, who should have been protected, were instead destroyed. The battlefield was not just in the trenches. It was in their bodies, in their veins, in their very existence. Imagine a young woman in Belgium, captured when her town was overrun. Soldiers drag her into a military tent. She has no choice but to comply, night after night, her body deteriorating. Weeks later, she contracts syphilis, her skin marked, her eyesight failing. Instead of being treated, She is ordered back to the line of men because the army has no shortage of soldiers willing to wait. Her life becomes nothing more than a weapon, her death a footnote, her story erased from history. And yet, there were thousands like her. History books will tell us about the trenches, the battles, the generals. They'll list the number of dead, the treaties signed, the borders redrawn. But hidden beneath those pages is a darker truth. The truth of the women turned into tools of war, and the soldiers who carried diseases home, infecting wives, children, and entire communities. This was the war no one wrote about. The war fought not with bullets, but with bodies. The war where desire was twisted into a weapon, and disease claimed victory long before peace was signed. So, the next time we remember World War I, let's not forget the silent victims. The women sacrificed, the soldiers betrayed, and the generations scarred forever by a war that used intimacy as its cruelest weapon. Because the greatest horrors of war are not always seen on the battlefield. Sometimes, they are hidden in the shadows where no one dares to look. How do you get the story? Please write your comment. Thank you.